While looking at vintage watches on eBay, I noticed that most of the watches, if they're not listed as for parts only, the movements have been serviced, and what I've noticed most is that the balance wheels have been switched out for a modern balance wheel. And what I mean by modern is balance wheels today on mechanical movements, they don't have weights embedded in the edge of the balance wheel. Today's methods of machining or producing a balance wheel are sophisticated enough that they can make it balanced just in the manufacturing process. They don't need to have a human actually balance it with these little screw-in weights. That's what they used to do on all watches before they had the capability of producing a machine balance wheel that was already balanced. So if you look at the movement that's in this picture, you'll see the balance wheel is the largest wheel on there. It looks like it's made out of brass or something. It's a brass color. And you'll see around the edge of that wheel, you'll see nothing. There's no little weights screwed into the edge, and that's because it's balanced. But what I've noticed is when they do that, they switch out the original balance wheel that had the weights with a modern one. If you look at the adjuster, which is the way that you adjust the time accuracy by increasing the speed or lessening the speed depending on if the watch is running fast or slow. You have the ability to do that. Mechanical watches are adjusted in various positions, and if you look at this picture here, the red arrow on top is pointing to that negative sign, and the red arrow on the bottom is pointing to the positive sign. And that blue arrow is pointing to the adjuster. So if you look at the adjuster, that's where you would turn the adjuster, and on the opposite end of the adjuster little tab there, you'll see kind of like a little notch. And that notch will be set to one of those increments between the minus and the plus. But on this one, you will notice that it looks like it's all the way over as far negative as it can go. And what I think is happening is when you put a modern balance wheel in a vintage movement that used to have the old style balance wheel with weights, they can't quite match the characteristics of the old balance wheel. So I've seen a lot of vintage watches, if you look at the movement, that adjuster will be either all the way to the negative or all the way to the positive, because it's either running way too slow and they had to bump it up, and because of the weight of the balance wheel or the new balance wheel, they had to go to extremes, to an extreme setting to make it actually keep accurate time. I'm just speculating here, but I think that's what's happening, because I've seen a lot of movements with that adjuster way out of whack. That adjuster from the factory should really only need to be set within one of those increments between the plus and the minus. And in the old days, expensive watches, you would see written on the movement, adjusted in 4 positions, adjusted in 2 positions, actually engraved into the movement. And what that means is the movement is actually stood upright, upside down, right side up, tilted, and each of those is they let it run and see how far it is out of time or out of accuracy, and they go in and adjust it by like a little hair, and then monitor it again for 24 hours and see if it, so they do it in all these positions, and then some of them, the really expensive watches, even do it for temperature differences, because temperature affects the balance wheel as well, because the balance wheel is going to expand and contract, and there are other ways that they used to do to compensate that with the balance wheel, and I'll show you that in a second. So here is a movement. If you look in the upper left, you'll see the little weights around embedded in the actual balance wheel. So here's a vintage Omega, and you'll see this movement. You see the little weights up in the upper left, that tiny little balance wheel. There's little weights screwed into the edge of the balance wheel itself. That's how they used to balance that balance wheel. And that thing had to be balanced. Those screws had to be put in there by hand while actually turning the balance wheel and just eyeballing it, and they would spin it. And if it just sat there and spin, you know, they can tell that it's balanced. I don't know all the particulars, but that's the gist of it. So here is a vintage balance wheel, and you can really see the weights embedded in various parts. And on some balance wheels, vintage style like this, you'll see some of the weights are not screwed in all the way. Some of them are. These look like they're all screwed in all the way down, but they can actually unscrew them a little bit, which affects the balance. And if you look closely, the staff in the middle, you'll see that one half of the balance wheel is connected to one side of that staff, and it goes around, and then it's not connected on the other side. And likewise, on the other side, it's the same way. It just goes in the opposite direction. And the reason for that is both sides are made from dissimilar metals, so that when the temperature changes, one metal will expand and contract differently than the other one based on hot or cold. And by choosing the correct metals, when the temperature changes, the hope is that the difference in their contracting or expanding will balance the entire wheel out, so that if you go in, say, a really hot climate and you use one metal type, it's going to expand at a certain rate, and that's going to affect the time accuracy. So the idea here is to eliminate as much difference in the time accuracy as you can based on temperature, because you might be out in 30-degree weather, you might be somewhere in the tropics and it's 100 degrees out. That could affect, in a vintage watch, that could affect accuracy a lot. And new watches don't do that because they use modern alloys, and it's balanced in the manufacturing process. So this little movie here that's coming up will show you how a human actually balanced these. So this is just a quick view of a balance wheel movement. There's a guy holding the balance wheel, showing the mainspring. You see the little weights, and some of them are screwed all the way in and some of them aren't. You see that one weight on the upper right is not all the way down. And there's the vintage balance wheel running in a Hamilton movement, and you'll see the adjuster is right in the middle. So here is the human actually going to balance. They don't actually show him putting the screws in, but apparently this one's already balanced, and you can see he barely touched it, and it's just spinning and spinning. So this is how they used to do it. So if you're looking at vintage watches on eBay or somewhere else, take a look at the balance wheel. You'll be able to see if it's a new one or the actual vintage one that came with the watch. In this example, this is a vintage movement, and you can see there's no weights around the balance wheel, which means this watch has had a new balance wheel put in, and certainly a new mainspring as well. The two red arrows you see are pointing to the S and the F. The S just means slow, F means fast. The blue arrow shows the adjustment indicator, so you would move that towards the F or the slow depending on how fast or slow the watch was actually running, and that way you can make the watch more accurate. As a little side note, there's an orange arrow there, and you'll see it's pointing to a jewel, which is basically at the top of the balance wheel shaft. And what that is if you look at the shape of that jewel, I believe that's known as an Incabloc anti-shock in there. I'm not exactly sure, because usually if it was Incabloc, they usually carved it into the back of the movement, so it may not be an Incabloc. But Incabloc was an invention that made it so that shaft underneath that jewel could move a certain distance without damaging. So if you drop the watch, that shaft, the shock from dropping it would allow that shaft to move a little bit, and then it wouldn't damage that shaft, which would then require service. Before Incabloc, in the old days when mechanical watches were the only watches available, if you dropped your watch, it was almost pretty much certain that it was not going to work anymore, and you had to take it to a watch repair shop and have it serviced and fixed, just with one drop. So with the advent of the Incabloc, it made mechanical watches way more robust. They could withstand a lot more, and that's when they started putting on the back of watch cases. You'll see them on a lot of vintage watches, and it says shockproof on the back. And they also said waterproof, but they're not shockproof and they're not waterproof. In fact, they stopped using the word waterproof on watches altogether. I forget what year, because no watch can actually be waterproof. They just say water resistant now. But anyways, and all manufacturers have their own version of Incabloc. I think like Seiko's version is called DiaShock. There was a whole bunch of different ones. Once Incabloc was invented, everyone copied it and made their own shock resistance. So anyways, that's my take on the new versus old balance wheels on vintage.